Welcome to Next in Tech, an S&P Global Market Intelligence podcast where the world of emerging tech lives. I'm your host, Eric Hanselman, Chief Analyst for Industry and Company Data at S&P Global Market Intelligence. And today, we're going to be talking about the intersection of advertising and technology. And with me to discuss it, I have two guests today. Natalie Colakides, the research analyst for S&P Global Market Intelligence. Natalie, welcome back to the podcast.
Thank you.
Great to have you back. And also, Ian Whittaker, the managing director for Liberty Sky Advisors. Ian, welcome.
Thank you, Eric.
We've been talking a lot about the transitions that are happening in technology and advertising in earlier episodes and some more research. And there are a whole set of impacts that are happening. Of course, the rise of AI, shifts in spending, shifts in media technology, and everything from smart TVs and their impacts on ads and digital advertising. There's a lot that's going on out there. Ian, maybe we'll start with you. A little bit of background in terms of what you see in the market and what you see as some of these transitions.
Yeah, I think it's quite interesting, actually. If you look, I guess there are two aspects of this. One is what advertisers think of advertising generally. And then second of all, how they're advertising and they're utilizing the various technologies. So if we look at how they are viewing advertising in general, my view is certainly listening to company results and listening to the comments from CEOs and CFOs. There's a definite shift that is going on there, where advertising is seen of more strategic importance than perhaps it was seen in the past. I think core reason for that was what happened back in 2022 with the inflation crisis, where many firms had to push through price increases to consumers very rapidly. And they realized it was the strength of their brands that enabled them to do so. And I think that has left a lasting effect for many companies in realizing, look, we had thought that marketing was more of a cost. We're now realizing it's more of an investment. So I would say underlying there is a shift there in the overall perception of how advertising is perceived at the board level. Still a long way to go, but there is a definite shift change there. I think in terms of how firms use advertising and the various technologies that they're utilizing, I think what we've got here is, there is so if you want to call it sort of a tentative dipping the toes in the water. Often figures that are quoted as say 70% of the 7% plus of global advertising spend is digital. What that tends to sort of do though is in a way overstate digital, simply because what it includes is SME spending that is small businesses that need to advertise on Google and Facebook because it is their shop front. If you actually look at larger corporates, I'd say the picture is more nuanced with things. So there are certain industries which still depend very much on, if you want to call it old-fashioned, I wouldn't call it old-fashioned, but sort of television, linear TV. Also as well, the offshoots in terms of broadcasting, video on demand, and so on. It's still recognized that those are very powerful mechanisms to reach the consumer. Now, at the same time as well, what you've got is that you've got other platforms that are now trying to, if you want to call it, sort of take a share of that television pie. YouTube has been the most vocal sort of that. But also as well, you've got TikTok and the other platforms. I think what's interesting with this whole sort of debate about technology is while the advertisers are thinking about this from what technologies are going to be best to reach the consumer in the future, the way I think particularly the technology firms are thinking about this is, are we going to see the growth that we've seen in the past in terms of advertising markets? And if we're not, do we actually need to take more share from some of the established players from television? And I think that's driving sort of some of the commentary that you've heard quite recently about YouTube saying YouTube is TV, the comments you've heard from Mark Zuckerberg talking about that we can automate the whole advertising process, from basically making your ads to distributing it, with the implication of that being that you cut out not only parts of the distribution chain, but also the agencies as well within there. So there's a mixture. What you're getting here is really a mixture of different things that are being fed into debate. How to reach the audience, so which technologies work, sort of what technologies are coming down the line, but also as well, particularly for the technology platforms, a question about how they sustain their revenue growth in the future in a way that will continue to please investors?
Well, we're just the other side of the Kagan Research Media and Telecom Summit, and we've just done a summary talking about some of the challenges that this presents in this shift from in you look at traditional media, the linear television. If you look at the invasion of the streaming channels in terms of not only in linear share in some of the major content areas, but also in one of those things that's been a bastion of the linear market, which is sports. And some of those shifts that are taking place there, linear has been viewed as the one place where, of course, you've got to be for sporting events. You want to be there at the moment. And yet you've now got streamers who are starting to edge their way into those areas as well, starting to vie for some of those advertising dollars in terms of where they actually, where they see being able to capture some of that spend and some of those transitions. Uh, Interesting to see that as we see this pendulum swinging sort of back and forth between the extent of cord cutting by the population globally, that shift in terms of consumption starts to move some of that ad opportunity as well.
I think it's interesting there. I mean, you're absolutely right. It's a very interesting dynamic that's going on at the moment. I think one thing that would say, and sometimes it does get overlooked, and it's completely understandable, given that most of the decision making come out of US headquarters. It is that there is actually a marked difference between the US markets and non-US markets, and arguably that difference is widening. If, for example, you take Europe. European consumers sort of watch television in a different way, and that's been historically the case. They haven't paid so much for pay TV services. Pay TV penetration has been significantly lower than the US. Sports rights sort of are not a mainstay of linear TV. And if you actually look at what's happening in the European markets, you know, both when it comes to streaming, sort of flatlining at sort of lower levels than the US, and you look at linear TV being more resilient than it is in the US market. You can see there that these trends are only sort of the divergence in terms of Europe, the US, and other markets. It's only getting wider. And so I think one thing that I would say is absolutely right in terms of what's happening in the US, particularly with linear TV, it faces significant structural challenges. There's also a question, quite frankly, of what is linear TV? As you say, in a market where YouTube and Amazon, which are streamers, are buying up NFL rights, which constitute the bulk of linear TV viewing, does it really make sense to actually have that sort of differentiation between linear and streaming? But I think that's actually a very sort of, I would say that's more of a US specific issue. I don't think it's necessarily something that, bar a couple of other markets in the world, is necessarily happening worldwide. And so I think this is another issue that I think advertisers face as well. Yeah, many of the decision makers are obviously based in the States because that's where many of the top global advertisers are headquartered. And it is natural that they look at the world through very much of a US lens. But actually, the sort of structure and the sort of what's happening sort of on the ground is actually very different in quite a lot of countries. And I think for advertisers, if they want to get the most effective result on a global basis from their advertising spend, I think they have to be sort of more careful, sort of a more nuanced about some of the trends that we're seeing in the US and applying them on a global basis.
Well, of course, yeah, if you look at the global markets broadly, treating them as any single view, of course, is something one does at one's peril. But
Exactly.
Natalie, I'm curious from your side, uh, what is it that you're seeing in the data in terms of how these markets are evolving?
I mean, the US has always been very different, but obviously we can't neglect it because it's like it accounts for over 40% of global advertising. So the bulk of the money is also there. So it makes sense to follow the trends. And basically, the trends that happen in the US do follow suits. Other countries do follow suit. Um, but like for Europe, that we were talking about, actually, in looking at the historical data, digital ad spend became larger than TV ad spend in Europe first and in the US second. I think the UK was actually one of the first markets where digital ad spend overtook TV. But I do think the industry is getting a lot more complicated today. Basically, it used to be we had like 5 buckets. You had linear TV, radio, print, and you knew where your budget was going. Whereas today, all of these now intertwine. And like if you're talking about TV, you're no longer talking about linear TV. You're talking about premium video. And that will include Netflix, since they have advertising, they will include broadcasters who have on demand, who have online viewing. All of this has basically been bucketed together. And I think that's what the industry is having a challenge to address, because the clients, the advertisers, they want KPIs, they want return. And that return can only be seen if you're marketing and the industry as a whole and not just those buckets specifically. They haven't been able to solve that challenge. They haven't been able to make a holistic approach to advertising.
It sounds like that really reinforces Ian's point,
Yeah.
which is that we're treating it as distinct entities is really a thing of the past.
Yeah, I think it's been a conversation that I've been hearing for the last 10 years, to be honest, just been aggravated in the last 2-3 years, maybe.
It finally reached a tipping point in terms of the. Well, I guess actually it's a good question. Is it the level of integration across them, and is there technology that plays a role in being able to address those markets as a greater whole as opposed to a set of buckets?
I think it's different factors coming into play. One is consumer trends. Basically, audiences have been fragmented into different platforms. So it used to be you advertise on linear TV and you had mass reach. That mass reach has basically decreased significantly. It's also that advertisers now know that with the data that's available, they should be able to see better KPIs, which they're not in many cases. It's also that there's a lot more different opportunities through AdTech that increase efficiencies. So there's so many things are coming into play. It's a lot more competitive than it used to be. It's not just controlled by like the big 4 ad agencies. They are losing their share from boutique agencies that are providing different offers or can provide more holistic or more data-focused solutions or more creative solutions. So it's become a whole new space, basically.
Well, so are we in a world in which the traditional agency-driven approach is significantly under threat? I mean, it seems like we're still a ways from being able to dive in with technology. I don't know, what's your thought on that?
Well, I don't think immediately. I think the agencies still play an extremely valuable role. I mean, I think many corporates would be very wary of handing over their advertising dollars to Mark Zuckerberg and saying, "Here you go, just run with it and do whatever you want with the money." And yeah, agencies in a way. I mean, in some ways, sort of they've created this situation, but bear in mind, agencies still add a large amount of value. Creative. My view is that creative in the world of AI actually becomes more important. Because if you want to look at AI in one way, what AI gives you is average. May give you average good, may give you average bad, but generally the work it produces will be around that average. The creative work of the agencies can take that sort of to a higher level. I think the vulnerability of the agencies is that essentially they're sort of for most of them, even though we don't know the exact figures, it's fair to say that their profitability is rooted in the media buying and planning sort of part. And that is the area that potentially could be most at risk when it comes to AI. But having said that, again, there is a reason why the agencies have managed to keep their position and keep their bargaining power when it comes to media buying and planning. And that is quite frankly, they do the job and they do the job well in terms of buying advertising slots for advertisers. And I don't think that necessarily changes it. And I've covered the agency space now for nearly 25 years. AI is not the first threat that people have talked about as been an existential threat to the agencies. We've heard before that essentially it was management consultants coming in. Then we heard that it was in-housing that would kill the agencies. These threats, there's been plenty of existential threats that have happened before. It doesn't mean, AI could be different. That's absolutely true. But at the moment, when you look at where AI is going, I don't see any world where essentially sort of that means that the agency's role becomes diminished. I think if there is a threat to the agencies, bizarrely enough, it may come from within themselves. And what do I mean by that? I think there's two sort of areas that would highlight. One is, quite frankly, agencies need to recognize the value that they give and be remunerated for it. And that may involve a change in the business model from what we have it now. But to go back to my earlier point, when you have firms turning around and saying the only reason we were able to get price increases to consumers and therefore drive revenue and earnings growth, and you've only got to look at a chart of US corporate profitability over the past 5 years to recognize that sort of there's been a massive increase come through that. And probably the single biggest factor that you can contribute to that, if you were to look at the root causes, was the strength of brand enabling these price increases to come through and therefore increasing margins. That's a huge value add to businesses, but agencies, bizarrely enough, don't necessarily recognize that. So there's one aspect of that. The second aspect, I think, is the potential to take sort of wrong fundamental strategic decisions, where quite frankly, there's an inability to reverse course if they turn out to be wrong. And one concern I do have with the agencies is, with all the talk of AI, some of the talk seems to be suggesting that AI will be the focus of their business moving forwards, and the central focus. And I think that's wrong. Because when it comes to AI, when it comes to technology, quite frankly, the agencies will never win. It will always be the technology companies. What they should concentrate on is their strengths. And their strengths are producing, quite frankly, work that adds value to a client and strategic value to a client.
Well, as we've discussed on the podcast a number of times, the idea that AI is an end into and of itself, uh, eh, somewhat heretical. But well, Natalie, so from the technology side, where do you see some of this displacement happening? It does seem like as we move towards a greater continuum in terms of advertising outcomes, moving away from a bucketed model, that in fact there is nuance. And is that something where technology helps or hinders?
I mean, and that's what I believe, that ad agencies are basically playing a little bit of catch up because it used to be very manual and very complicated, and they're trying to streamline their processes, which they do need to do. If they achieve that, they'll be able to compete with the smaller companies or keep clients from going in-house, and they will be able to prove their value, essentially. That's the challenge. It's because their clients are asking, okay, how much is this specific ad? What is it giving me? And often they can't answer on the spot. That technology and leveraging the data that they have can definitely help add value for the agencies. I do agree that they're not going to be completely replaced. I don't think they're immediately under threat. There was a similar conversation a few years back when programmatic was and real-time bidding was like coming up, and they were saying, oh, media buyers are going to be replaced. But it was just adapting the way you were working. You had now programmatic specialists within the agencies because the clients themselves are not going to be able to have the capabilities to do the same job or as well. A few clients who tried ended up paying more and had worse results than the agencies could.
Some of this, I think, is really an understanding about what those various channels are to their audiences, and making sense of it in nuances that go well beyond just simply being able to bin ad spend in particular areas. I guess, are we heading towards a world in which there needs to be balance between that demand for some level of hard KPI and the other side of the coin, Ian, to your point, of fundamental brand building, which is a harder thing to identify in terms of what that delivered value is, but yet so much more critical from an enterprise market presence.
I think advertisers kind of learned their lesson during COVID, where initially they cut budgets, and then they saw that by investing in advertising and marketing campaigns, they kept their brand image, they kept their presence, and so their sales didn't necessarily plummet afterwards. And since then, it's the first time, like I think last year, the first time where it used to be GDP growth and ad spend were going in parallel, whereas now they started to diverge because even with inflation, even with like a slower economy, companies have recognized that that brand image and that brand presence is giving them results, but they still haven't been able to prove it, basically.
I think you've got two things here. I think it's interesting to go back to Natalie's point. Usually when you would get sort of companies cutting back, for example, their top line guidance, cuts to advertising would also follow as well, because companies were trying to maintain their profitability. What was very interesting in the Q1 results season was the number of large consumer facing companies that actually doubled down. Yet even someone like a Procter and Gamble, who cut their top line guidance, said, we're not going to make, effectively say, we're not going to cut for a quarters basis and then damage our long-term profitability. And I think, again, it goes back to this point that, the inflation crisis proved to many firms just the value of advertising. And again, that it's been moved more from the cost bucket into the investment bucket. Now, on the point of being able to prove the value of advertising, I think really what you've got there are two things. I mean, one is, my background is, by the way, as a historian, so this will part explain what I'm going to say next. But one of the things, one of the concerns that I think I would have with the advertising industry is that it's gone down a rabbit hole as we were trying to find the perfect answer and trying to find that everything can be proven to 100%. Yeah, and in many ways, many of the conversations that I hear about what's happening in advertising at the moment and what's going on and almost as were the quest for perfect sort of KPI or measurement, it almost sounds like the medieval theologians discussing how many angels can you fit on a pinhead. Yeah, it gets down into such esoteric topics and such of things about quantification that the actual the actual outcome gets forgotten. Let's go back to what many companies were actually saying. They were saying it was their brand strength that was driving their revenue growth and profitability. They weren't talking about the strength of hard metrics. They weren't talking about the fact that they actually managed to get measurement done to an nth degree. They weren't talking about the effects of programmatic. What they actually said was was talking about the strength of branding and the effect that actually has had. And I would argue that in a way, one of the sort of greatest concerns that I would have from an advertising industry standpoint, but I think has been one of the greatest successes of the tech companies that rely on advertising, such as Meta and Google, is what they have done is effectively they have moved the sort of debate around advertising from effectively trying to frame it as a scientific process and actually trying to get it to be all around the science and technology. And of course, who does that benefit? Of course, it will benefit the tech companies because that's where all their skills lie. It takes it away from the advantages of the agency groups. And so I think one of the things that we have to get back to, and it's a very roundabout way, I guess, of answering your question about the hard KPIs and fundamental brand building, is there needs to be more of a balance. What has happened within the industry, this is just my opinion, is that there has been too much focus on essentially the desire for a scientifically proven process that means that if you spend X, you will automatically get Y. And what we need to start to think about is not talking about certainties, but probabilities. That's where I think the advertising industry needs to get back to.
That fundamentally, this is about influencing human behavior, and in fact, there will always be an art to that, and certainly some underlying science, but that, to your point, that mix is where we need to go. Uh, Natalie, any thoughts on that direction?
No, I agree. I've been to too many meetings and conferences where people are talking about their KPIs, and we forget that basically marketing started as an influencer idea. It didn't start as a KPI idea. It's just the challenge of persuading the investors to agree to it sometimes.
What's funny with that, I did the survey with the IPA in the UK, the Institute of Practitioners of Advertising, 18 months ago, we asked financial analysts and investors, both in the US and the UK, what was the single most important attribute sort of they had that they deemed to be important and very important when it came to looking at a firm. The top answer, with 79%, and it was ahead of reported profit, strength of management, all of the qualities, was the strength of the brand. And so I think analysts and investors, the bizarre thing is, analysts and investors, the financial markets do get this, that companies do need a strong brand in order to price through. I think sometimes companies forget that investors are thinking that way. And it comes down to short-term pressures, quarterly earnings. There's always the desire to actually meet the forecast because otherwise your stock gets hit. But I think that actually the financial markets are probably more savvy when it comes to the whole importance of brand than many company managements think.
Well, I mean, your end consumers of marketing and ad spend are not only the actual consumers of the product, but the market as well. So, it really is a much broader portfolio that you're looking in terms of that influence. Well, this has been great. I appreciate both of your insights. Unfortunately, we are at time for this episode. But thank you for joining me, Ian and Natalie. Thanks very much.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you very much.
And that is it for this episode of Next in Tech. Thanks to our audience for staying with us. And thanks to our production team, including Sophie Carr, Farhan Miadashian, Kira Smith, and Adam Kowalski on the marketing and events teams. Please keep in mind that statements made by persons who are not S&P Global Market Intelligence employees represent their own views and are not necessarily the views of S&P Global Market Intelligence. I hope you'll join us for our next episode, where we're going to be looking at a different kind of impact. We'll be looking at the creator economy and digging into that from both the influencing and the technology sides. I hope you'll join me then, because there's always something next in tech.